You're still muted, Tom?
Yep, can you hear me okay?
Yeah, now it's good. Sound seems to be good, cursor I see. Okay. Let us wait for 1 more minute. Yeah, so welcome back from the break. Last but not least, we have Tom Griffiths, and Tom, please go ahead.
Great. Yeah, it's great to be here. I've been really enjoying all of these different talks from the workshop, and I'm excited to have the chance to talk a little bit about some of the work that we've been doing, looking at curiosity, but also how some of the principles related to curiosity can also help us to explain other aspects of human cognition. And I think as I start to talk about those, you'll see some of the connections to some of the other talks that we've been hearing over the last couple of days. So the cognitive scientist and neuroscientist David Ma suggested that when we're trying to make sense of an information processing system, we can do that at multiple levels of analysis. So he talked about the computational level, which is really about trying to understand the abstract computational problem that the system is solving and what the ideal solution to that problem looks like. The level of representation and algorithm, which is about what the algorithm is that actually implements that solution. You can kind of think about this as the analog of cognitive processes in humans, or the kinds of algorithms that you might write on a computer as a way of solving a problem. And then the level of implementation, which is how it is that that algorithm is actually realized physically. And again, you can think about that as sort of neural implementation in humans and other animals, or the implementation in silicon in a computer. And so I think one thing that's been really nice about all of the talks that we've been seeing is that we've seen analyses of curiosity that have engaged with these different levels. We started out sort of at this implementation level, talking about neural bases of curiosity and reward and surprise. We've heard talks that focus on algorithms, both on the human side and on the computer side. What I'm going to do today is focus on this computational level of analysis. And what I'm going to do is try and engage with the question of what the underlying computational problem is and what an ideal solution looks like, and maybe what that can tell us about the nature of curiosity and some other aspects of human cognition. So the first thing that we need to do to sort of pursue this kind of analysis is to think about what sorts of computational problems humans face. And one thing that's interesting about this is that I think a lot of the kinds of computational problems that humans face diverge in interesting ways from the computational problems that our machines and artificial intelligences might face. And these points of divergence are actually things that can help us understand things about human cognition. So one important point of divergence is that humans have finite computational resources, right? We just have the, amount of compute that we can fit inside our heads, about 3 pounds of, cells that are stuck together. And that's it. That's what we have for doing our computation, which is different from a machine where you can recruit more processors, more powerful processors. You can parallelize a computation. And indeed, many of the advances that we've seen in AI over the last few years have partly been a consequence of being able to leverage increasing amounts of computation. Another key problem for humans is the fact that we die, right? That we have a finite lifespan, a finite amount of time in the world. And that time that we spend in the world is the time that we have for learning all the things that we're going to do and also doing all the things that we want to be able to do. And so, again, this is maybe a way that humans differ from machines in terms of the scale over which we have to learn. We can't solve a problem by just simply increasing the amount of data that we get exposed to. You saw examples of this in Mark's talk, where some of the most recent superhuman performance from some of the systems he was talking about came from, in fact, perhaps superhuman amounts of training. And that's certainly true in other kinds of AI systems as well. And so if we think about these kinds of constraints as shaping the computational problems that human minds face, then you get a picture of human intelligence that might be different from the kinds of things that we'd expect our AI systems to do. One where what we're trying to do is to navigate the world using the finite resources that we have, these constraints of computation and time. And so in many ways, one of the most fundamental computational problems for humans is figuring out how it is that we should spend the limited time that we have in order to let us do the things that we want to do. And so I'm going to use that as the basis for then thinking about these different aspects of human cognition that we want to understand, curiosity and decision-making and planning. And I'll talk about a kind of broader framework that we can use for analyzing human cognition from this perspective. So the first part of the talk, I'm going to focus on these questions about curiosity. This is joint work with Rajat Dubey, who is actually, he was also the first author on the work that Deepak mentioned about looking at investigating human priors by creating different kinds of video games. And what we wanted to engage with in this work was, I think, a question that's come up at various points over the last couple of days about, what it is that's actually the factor that drives curiosity. And if you look in the literature, there are two different kinds of perspectives, both theoretically and empirically, about what seems to affect what people are curious about. So schematically, you can kind of represent these theories in terms of the relationship between how curious you are about something and how much you've been exposed to it. And so one of these theories really focuses on novelty. So it says that we'll be most curious about those things that we know the least about, that we've been exposed to the least. And the other focuses on the idea that maybe there's something which is more like a kind of U-shaped function, right? So, or an inverted U-shaped function, where you're most curious about the things that are not the ones that you know the least about, not the ones that you know the most about, but the ones that are somewhere in the middle. And exactly how this manifests differs in different theories. It could be because those are the ones that you want to learn, that they sort of provide the most potential for learning. It could be because those are the things that are sort of, in some other way, a consequence of some kind of sweet spot that I think people have offered lots of different kinds of explanations for. And empirically, you find patterns that are consistent with both of these. Again, going all the way back to Berlin's work, you see a preference for novelty. In some of the more recent work on curiosity, you see this kind of U-shaped function. And so what we wanted to understand is what seems like a little bit of a paradox in the fact that there are these two very different views that both have theoretical motivation and both have empirical support. And so what we wanted to do was ask, is there a way of formulating the computational problem underlying curiosity in terms of a simple unifying perspective that allows us to explain both of these kinds of patterns that we see in the literature? And so what I'm going to do now is sort of talk you through a computational problem, and then I'll show you what the consequences of this problem are. So we assume that we have an agent that lives in a world where there's a bunch of different kinds of problems that that agent wants to solve. Or if we put this more sort of in psychological language, you can imagine that agent is being exposed to a bunch of different stimuli. And then in the future, they're going to encounter one of these stimuli and then have to take an action. And if they take the appropriate action, they receive some reward. If they take the wrong action, then they don't receive a reward. And so this agent is really trying to get to the point where for all of the stimuli in the world that it's, the things that it's likely to encounter in the future, it's able to produce the appropriate response and as a consequence, maximize its reward. And the problem that the agent faces is the problem of deciding what to explore in its environment. So what we then want to do is sort of turn this abstract problem into something that has a little bit of math behind it. So the way that I'm going to do this is going to take these different stimuli that we could encounter and then assume that for each of these stimuli, there's some probability that the agent produces the correct response for that stimulus. I'm going to call this probability the confidence that the agent has in its response. This is kind of a subjective impression of what the probability is of being able to succeed in solving that problem or responding to that stimulus. And I'm going to assume that the agent here is sort of veridically aware of what that confidence level is. We're also going to assume that confidence, the probability of producing the correct response to a stimulus, is something which increases with exposure to the stimulus. And here we can make pretty weak assumptions about the nature of that relationship. So we're just going to assume that it's a monotonic function and that's something that saturates, right? Sort of it's a negatively accelerated monotonic function. And so this is kind of a way of just characterizing, as you get exposed to things in the world, you're more likely to learn from them and learn what the appropriate action is to take next time you see that thing. A second variable we need to define is the probability that you encounter that stimulus or that problem in the future. And so for each of these stimuli, we can imagine different probabilities that are associated with that. And then from this, we can work out what we're going to call the value of knowledge of the agent. So the value of the agent's knowledge here is something that we express as basically the probability that the agent produces the correct answer in that instant when it encounters a randomly selected stimulus in the future. And so the way that this is expressed is simply as the sum over all of those stimuli of the probability that you encounter that in the future multiplied by the probability you produce the correct answer. And so having formulated things in these terms, we can now ask what the optimal solution is to this problem of exploration that's presented to the agent. And in this simple scenario, we can kind of derive directly what that looks like. So if the agent is trying to maximize the value of its knowledge, that is, maximize the probability that it receives the reward, and that moment where it makes that future choice through the choice of its exposure, then we can give a simple characterization of what the optimal solution looks like, which is in this case to choose the exposure for which the derivative of the value of its knowledge is greatest, right? So basically choose the exposure that most drives up the value of its knowledge. And the way that this works out is that we have two terms that we want to worry about. One is, what's the probability that we're going to encounter that stimulus or that problem in the future? And the second is, what's the amount of change that we get in our confidence as a consequence of experiencing that particular, that particular stimulus and having an opportunity to learn from it? And that's where the form of this function comes in, where something that we know more about, this value might be smaller. Something that we know less about, this value might be higher. And so just using this very simple model, where we define the environment that the agent's in, we define the agent's goal as maximizing its future reward, and we define this sort of we derive from that this sort of strategy for exploring in this world. We can actually characterize two different patterns of behavior that result as a consequence of the relationships between the variables that I talked about. So these variables are the probability that an event occurs in the future, the amount of exposure that the agent has to that stimulus, and then the confidence that the agent has in the probability of producing the correct answer. And so in one setting where the probability with which you encounter things in the future is unrelated to the frequency in which you encountered them in the past, you can show that what the form of that optimal solution looks like is one where you should seek novelty. So under this particular model, and I'm going to explain why in a moment, the agent should choose those stimuli to which it's had the least exposure as the things that are going to maximize that derivative that I talked about previously. Whereas in another circumstance, the one where the frequency with which you've encountered things in the past is a consequence of the probability with which you encountered them in the, you're going to encounter them in the future. So you're sort of assuming that the encounters from the past are sort of drawn from the same distribution that's the distribution you're going to see in the future. Then the optimal solution is one that produces this classic sort of canonical inverted U shape. So as a function of exposure, you should prefer to explore those things which you've sort of seen an intermediate amount or sort of know an intermediate amount about. And so you can think about these two different scenarios as corresponding to two different situations that you could find yourself in. One where you sort of know nothing about what the future is going to be like, and you sort of don't have a basis for having expectations about how likely it is that you're going to encounter different kinds of stimuli. And the other where you're making an assumption that the future is going to be like the past. And just from those two different assumptions, we can get these two canonical forms of curiosity-like behavior. So just to explain where that comes from, I'm just going to sort of talk through these two cases in a little more detail. So in the case where the past and the future are independent, then this is a situation where the amount that you've seen something in the past is not an indicator of the probability it's going to occur in the future. And so here I'm just sort of representing that by having a uniform distribution over the probabilities of the occurrence of each of these stimuli in the future, sort of maximally agnostic about what the future is going to be like. And so in that situation, what you want to do, right, if you sort of think about the challenge that you have here, the things that are going to be most problematic for you are those things that you know least about, right? So it's equally likely that you would be exposed to any of these stimuli. The ones that you know something about already, you don't necessarily need to learn more about. Those are sort of not going to make a big contribution to that derivative. Remember, we're making the assumption that that function is saturating, so you know a lot. It's going to be harder to learn something new. And so the derivative is biggest for those things where you don't know a lot about something already. And that matters because those are going to be things that if you're equally likely to encounter those things in the future, they could make a big contribution to your sort of the overall value of your knowledge, the probability that you make a successful choice in the future. And so the curiosity, the things that you're going to want to investigate the most are going to be those things which you have the lowest confidence about. In the situation where the past and the future are correlated with one another, that is where the frequency that you've encountered something in the past reflects the probability of those things occurring in the future. And again, the assumption here that we're making is that effectively you're seeing samples that are drawn from that same distribution, and you're making the assumption that distribution will hold in the future. Then in this situation, you don't care so much about those things that you don't know a lot about, because the reason you don't know a lot about them is that you haven't encountered them very often in the past. And the fact that you haven't encountered them very often in the past is an indicator that you're unlikely to encounter them in the future. And so as a consequence, you're not particularly interested in those things which you have sort of low levels of confidence about or low levels of exposure to. Likewise, you shouldn't be concerned about things that you know a lot about, right? So if you know a lot about something, then that's an indication that you were exposed to it a lot in the past. And as a consequence of that, it's likely that you'll be exposed to it a lot in the future. The things that you should care about are those things that you have moderate levels of confidence about, because those are things that have occurred a fair amount in the past, but you still don't know a whole lot about them. And so as a consequence, this is a situation where that derivative of the value of your knowledge is maximized by exploring the things that you sort of know an intermediate amount about. And that's where that U-shaped function comes from. So this model gives us a sort of clear characterization of a variable that seems to be relevant to differentiating between these two modes of causality that have been investigated in the literature. And so we actually did a series of experiments where we sort of tried to dig into the predictions of this model deeper. I'm just going to show you one of these experiments to give you a flavor of what that looks like. And so this was an experiment where we used a sort of standard curiosity paradigm, and we broke the experiment into multiple phases that gives us the opportunity to control the assumptions that people should be making about the environment that they're in. So in the first phase of the experiment, we just showed people a bunch of questions, and then for each of those questions, asked them to rate how curious they were and how likely it is that they'd answer that question correctly. In the second phase, we would ask them, show them the question again, and then ask them if they just wanted to find out the answer to that question. And so again, this is a measure of curiosity, right? This is a way of measuring what things people are actually interested in finding out the answers to. And then in the third phase, they were going to answer 10 questions. And so those questions would be drawn from the things that we'd shown them previously. But the critical thing here is that in the second phase, they would have the opportunity to explore these questions with the knowledge that they were going to be quizzed on them in the third phase. And what we manipulated was the distributions that were involved in the third phase, right? So basically influencing the structure of the environment that people are in a way that allowed us to set up circumstances that corresponded to those two different situations that I talked about previously. So we take those 40 questions from the first phase, and then in the confidence condition, the confidence that people rated in how likely they are to know the answer to the question was used to determine the probability that one of those questions would be sampled to have people answer in the third phase. And so by doing that, we were building in this correlation between the amount of exposure that people had had to that thing in the past and the frequency with which they would encounter it in the future. In the uniform condition, we implemented the sort of independence between those two things, how often you've seen it in the past and how likely you were to see it in the future, by just choosing the problems completely at random from that set of 40 that people had seen before. And so now each question is equally likely to appear, and what we've done is broken that relationship. There's now no relationship between confidence and probability in the future. And so the predictions that we make in the circumstance are that in this first phase, where we just sort of ask people to say how curious they are about things, that's basically replicating the sort of standard design in a lot of these experiments. That's where we expect to see something like that U-shaped function. That's what the previous literature has shown us. But in the second phase, we expect that U-shaped function to only hold in the situation where people are expecting the degree of confidence that they have to be the thing that predicts how likely it is that they're going to have to answer a question in the third phase. So remember, in that second phase, they're making a choice about what they want to explore with the knowledge of what the environment they're going to encounter in the third phase is going to be like. And so if they're adaptively modifying the way that they're exploring on the basis of those expectations about their environment, then we're going to expect to see that for the uniform condition, where we've broken that dependency, we're going to see a decreasing relationship between confidence and curiosity. And so just to sort of show you what these results look like, right? This is phase one. These look, exactly the same. We see the kind of U-shaped function that we've seen in the past. But then in phase 2, we see that that environment structure matters. So even in this, very simple lab study in an artificial environment that we've constructed, that's enough to change the way that people approach their exploration so that we can get them to switch between something which is more novelty focused, where the probability of exploring things that they know less about is suddenly significantly increased, versus a more sort of inverted U-shaped relationship where they're going to focus on the things that have moderate levels of knowledge about. So at a high level, this is really aiming to provide us with a kind of unifying story that we can use to think about these different kinds of results that show up in the psychological literature on curiosity. But I think there's a deeper idea here, which is this notion of thinking about engaging with the environment in a way where we're going to gather information which we can use for guiding future actions. And that deeper idea is something that's organized a lot of the other research that we've been doing in the lab that's focused on trying to understand factors such as decision-making, planning, and other aspects of human cognition. And so in the second part of the talk, I'm going to take you through some of those results. And the work I'm going to talk about here is joint work with Fred Callaway, who's a graduate student at Princeton, and Falk Lieder, who's a junior group leader at Max Planck Institute in Tübingen. So the real, I think, picture that comes out of this is one where, as a consequence of thinking about the constraints that humans are operating under, these kinds of constraints of time and limits on computation, we kind of need to rethink the way that we think about rational decision making. So your kind of classic notion of rationality and decision making is something like expected utility theory, which tells us that what we should be doing as agents is focusing on taking the action that has the highest expected utility. Or if we kind of reduce that to a slogan, we're going to try and do the right thing, right? And the emphasis here is on thing in the sense of trying to choose the action, right? Our optimization is over actions that maximizes the expected utility. Whereas there's a different notion of rationality that's been proposed in the computer science literature among people who work on artificial intelligence and want to understand what rationality should look like for finite agents, which there's a few sort of variants on this. I'm going to focus on one that's called meta-level rationality. There are also terms like bounded optimality, computational rationality that are used. But here the idea is that the way we're going to think about rationality is instead in terms of the strategy that best trades off utility and computational cost. And so now our sort of outer maximization here is over not the actions that we're taking in the world, but over the computational actions that we're taking inside our head, over the policy or algorithm or strategy that we're going to follow, that's going to result in a sequence of computations which produce beliefs, where those beliefs are good for choosing what action we're going to take in terms of maximizing expected utility as an outcome. And so here the emphasis is shifted to doing the right thinking, right? It's shifted to the internal cognitive processes that we engage in order to explore, what the right solution to a problem might look like. And so this might seem like a kind of a long way away from curiosity, which we think of as really something which is a property of how we explore the external world. But I think it has a strong parallel in that it's really about a similar kind of question of how it is that we use our cognitive resources, and in particular, how we use those resources to generate the information on which we're going to base our future actions. You can kind of think about this in a sort of cartoon view as something where if expected utility theory is focused on these external actions, this kind of meta-level rationality, or we call it resource rationality, is something that focuses on the internal computational actions that we're going to take to give us the information that we're going to use to act in the world. And those computational actions can be, the sort of investigation of sources of information that we might want to use when we're making a decision. So putting this emphasis on these internal computational actions gives us a clue that this is something that we might be able to think about in terms of other kinds of tools that we've developed in other places for thinking about how to choose the right actions to take. So in particular, a lot of the work that we've been doing is taking a kind of classic and familiar model of sequential decision-making and turning it into something which we can use as a model for thinking about how to choose internal computational actions. And again, drawing on the AI literature, where this is something that's called a meta-level Markov decision process, what we can do is define a sequential decision problem where that sequential decision problem is to choose a sequence of computations that we're going to execute to allow us to get to the point where we have beliefs that then support making intelligent choices in the world. And so the way that we make this, sort of set this up is that we have a Markov decision process where the state space is the beliefs that we have about the world. The action space are the computations that we're going to perform that are going to modify those beliefs. Those computations are associated with computational costs. And then as a consequence of executing a particular computation, it changes our belief in some way. And at some point we get to the point where instead of executing further computation, we make the decision to act in the world. And so again, this has a parallel with that very simple model that I was thinking about in the context of curiosity. But now it introduces this extra dependency of our sort of unfolding sequence of actions and the idea that at some point we're going to want to stop exploring and be ready to take an action in the world. And so this kind of meta-level Markov decision process, I think, gives us some insight into some of the other kinds of problems that have come up in people's talks. So for example, one application that we've explored is a sort of simple choice setting, which I think is analogous to the kind of problems that Jackie was talking about, where what we're interested in doing here, we're thinking about the computational actions as being the information that you're gathering by fixating on one of these items when you're making a decision about what kind of snack you might want to eat. So in the neuroscientific and psychological literature, the kinds of models that have been applied to this sort of problem are things like the attentional drift diffusion model, where the idea is that you have some kind of internal accumulator process, and then your fixations are things that influence the drift rate of that process. So if you're fixated on one item, then that's going to be something which is going to sort of push you towards the boundary for that item as you're sort of gathering information about how good you think that is, basically a sort of multiplicative effect on the drift rate of this diffusion process. But in these kinds of models, the actual way in which you're determining what the fixations are is assumed to be something which is exogenous to the model, something that is sort of essentially random in terms of the previous models that people have worked on. What we're interested in doing is seeing whether there's a way of explaining not just the choices that people end up making and their dependencies that exist between how long people look at something and the kind of choices that they make that are sort of the variables that are used for evaluating these models, but also whether we can explain what the actual fixation process is using this kind of view of people as engaging in a kind of optimal information gathering process. And so the way that we set this up in terms of a sequential decision problem is by thinking about each of these options as being associated with some probability distribution over values. And then for each of those options, when we think about it or when we fixate on it, what we're doing is generating a sample from the true distribution over the values of that object. And as a consequence of that, we can use Bayesian inference to update our beliefs about what the value of that object might be. And from this, we can then sort of set up our meta-level Markov decision process and derive what the optimal strategy looks like. So now the belief states of our meta-level MDP correspond to the probability distributions over the values of those objects. The actions that we're taking are sort of drawing our samples from those distributions. Here, this is these sort of the eye movements that we're making. There's a cost which is associated with each moment of time we're spending thinking about these things, but also a cost for switching our eyes between one thing and another. And then at some point, we make the decision that we're ready to act and we make our underlying choice. And so we can evaluate this kind of model against data that have been collected using these sorts of tasks. Here, I'm going to focus on one classic data set. What we find when we do that is that we find a clear relationship between fixation time and choice. That's kind of one of the classic results in this literature that falls directly out of this model. And so the reason why you see this, so what this is showing is that the probability that somebody chooses something increases with the amount of time that they spend looking at it. And the model predicts this because effectively, if you kind of think about it, if you look at each of the things, you've got some rough sample from them. And then if one of them is less good than the other two, then you're going to spend less time looking at that. You're going to focus on the two that are the contenders. You're going to spend more time looking at those. And as a consequence, you're going to end up spending sort of more of your attentional resources on those cases that are the ones that are most relevant to the decision. And those are going to be the things that are the higher value items. And you see this relationship expressed directly in terms of the proportion of fixation time and the actual relative item value, which people provide independent ratings of and that we can use to then correlate against the time that people actually spend looking at things. And again, the model makes this clear prediction that you should see a relationship between the value of an item and how long people should end up looking at it, just as a consequence of pursuing the rational strategy in that information gathering context. And this relationship becomes particularly enhanced as time goes on. So basically, as you sort of start ruling things out and you get down to what are the final contenders, that's something that produces an even stronger emphasis on the probability of fixating the highest value item as a function of time. So this same kind of simple model is something that we can extend to much more complex kinds of cognitive processes. So here I've sort of talked about curiosity and then these kinds of decision-making problems as cases where we have this sort of information gathering challenge. But I think, in fact, it's a general attribute of human cognition that whenever we're trying to engage with solving a problem, we have to engage in a process of perhaps internal information gathering. And so a good illustration of that is in the context of something like a planning problem. And so here I'm using a much simpler scenario than the kinds of games that Mark was talking about, but I think the same kind of challenge holds, which is one of kind of figuring out what you should think about before you get to the point where you're ready to act. And so the way that we explore this in our lab is using a version of something that's been called the mouse lab task. We use an extension of this to Markov decision processes that we've developed. But basically the problem is you have to get this little spider, and the spider has to choose a path that it's going to take. And the score that the person receives is the sum of the rewards that are in each of the nodes that lie along that path. And the catch is that you don't know what those are, right? And so this is our way of kind of, in the lab, simulating the process of having to sort of mentally explore what your options are in a sequential decision problem before you take an action. The way that we capture this is now if you click on one of these nodes, it reveals what the reward is that's behind it. And so we can look at the sequences of clicks that people make as a way of measuring what their sort of cognitive exploration of this space of possibilities looks like. And then we can evaluate how well that's captured by this kind of information gathering model. And so again, we can express this in a meta-level Markov decision process where now the belief states in that process correspond to the knowledge that we have about the value of each of those nodes in our network, in our sequential decision problem. The actions that you take are evaluating a node, choosing a node that you're going to click on, and then you pay a cost for doing that, and then at the end you get a reward which corresponds to the reward from the actual path that you end up choosing. And so in this setting, we can actually compare people's choices against this optimal solution, but also against a variety of different kinds of algorithms that have been proposed for planning, both in computer science and cognitive science. And basically what we find is that the optimal solution here does a better job than all of these different sort of algorithms that have previously been proposed of capturing the way that people engage in information gathering in the context of this kind of planning task. And the reason why it does that is that people display a level of adaptivity in their choices, which is not captured by any of these models, but is captured by this optimal solution. And so to kind of illustrate this, I'm going to show you here in this graphic. This is showing how the value of the best path that people have discovered so far and the number of clicks that they've made in exploring that graph relate to the termination probability. So the color shows the probability that somebody is going to stop searching and choose a path. And what you should be able to see is that as we go from the bottom left-hand corner here up towards the top right, this color goes from sort of a dark blue, indicating that there's a low termination probability, to a bright yellow, indicating that people are very likely to terminate. And what this is reflecting is a sort of very sensible kind of adaptive planning, because what it's showing is that people are more willing to terminate when they've found paths that have good high value relative to the number of clicks that they've executed. You can kind of think about this as a sort of optimal stopping problem, where what you should be doing is trying to evaluate whether the information that you're going to gain from an additional click is going to be enough that it's worth that relative to the cost of the click. And if you've already discovered a pretty good solution and you've already made a bunch of clicks, it's unlikely that you're going to discover something which is better, making an additional click, and as a consequence, you should be ready to terminate. So this kind of behavior is something that's exhibited by the optimal solution, and it's something that we see in humans, but it's not something which is exhibited by the sort of canonical algorithms that are used for solving these kinds of search problems. So part of what our model is learning is really how it is that we can solve this kind of problem of deciding when we've gathered enough information and knowing when to stop in a way that corresponds to the kind of strategies that human beings seem to have learned. So these two examples of decision making and planning are, I think, just two instances of places where this kind of trade-off between the computational resources and the time that we have, comes up against the reward that we're trying to gain through pursuing a sequence of actions. And I think this kind of idea of sort of optimal information gathering is something that cuts much more broadly across different aspects of cognition. But it's also something that I think is relevant in some ways to AI. And so in another line of work that I'm not going to have time to talk about, we've looked at how a similar kind of meta-level control is something that you can use to construct artificial neural networks that we're going to use to solve problems. And so the idea here is that if you think about each layer of an artificial neural network as a computation that you could choose to execute, the problem of constructing a network to solve a problem is now something that you turn into a sequential decision problem. And so the structure of that sequential decision problem is you're going to decide, you get some input, you're going to decide a sequence of transformations that you're going to execute on that input, which correspond to the layers of a network that you're going to end up building, such that you get something which is your desired output. And you can actually formulate this as a reinforcement learning problem, where what we learn is a controller that learns to control a bunch of neural modules that can be stacked together into a sequence that corresponds to a neural network. And you can adaptively construct those neural networks to solve different kinds of problems in a way that allows you to reuse pieces of information that you've experienced in the past. So I think the high-level conclusions here are, first of all, that the rational use of limited resources is something that gives us a way to understand different patterns of curiosity. But more generally, this kind of formulation of the sorts of computational problems that humans face is something that gives us a way of understanding many different aspects of cognition in terms of a process of optimal information gathering. And that I think one of the most exciting things here is that we can formalize this kind of process using a mathematical framework that's typically used to study external actions. And so I think making this connection between the sort of internal cognitive information gathering processes that we engage in and something like the Markov decision process framework that we're used to using for studying how an agent should choose the actions that they perform externally in the world gives us a new set of tools that we can then use for making sense of how human minds work. In particular, there are deep connections between, as we've seen in all the talks, things like Markov decision processes and things that we know about how human brains work that I think we have the opportunity to apply in this much more metacognitive context as a means of making sense of human cognition at all of those different levels of analysis. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Tom. Very well in time. Questions? Ali Reza got a question.
It was a very nice talk. Thank you very much. And I really like the work. I had a question about the first part and mainly about the theory. I cannot really understand the framework because you define these PK elements and say that the objects appear with this probability. And then you're saying that in the first case of novelty, you're saying that the past is independent of the future. But I cannot see that how this can happen because these PKs are fixed in time and the future samples are coming from the same distribution. It's just that people are not estimating them anymore. And
okay, so the key assumption here is that you're in a situation where you actually don't know what the future is going to be like. So the kinds of examples that we think about are things like if I tell you you're going to move to another country tomorrow, somewhere that's completely different where you've never lived before, then that should be something which should lead you to focus on novelty, right? In the sense of you need to find out about all of the things that you know nothing about, right? And that's just a consequence of the change in distribution. And so I think it's kind of easy to come up with, so the circumstances where it makes sense to be focused on novelty are ones where you don't expect that that relationship from the past to the future is going to hold. There's some sort of relevant change point, or you kind of know nothing about what the future is like, right? So if you've got very little experience in a domain, then that's something where you should also be novelty focused, because you don't have enough information to estimate what the future distribution will be.
Do I know PKs or not?
So no, so we're assuming you don't know the PK, you just know your experience of it, which can give you an estimate of what those are. When we did the mathematical analysis, we assumed that PK is, we're using PK in that context, but in terms of a strategy that you can actually use in the world, you have to estimate what those are.
Okay, thank you.
Jacqueline?
Yeah, so I have two questions. So Tom, yeah, this is a great framework. I really like the framework, the way of thinking about this. And okay, and I had two questions. So one, since we're talking about that task with PK, the two functions. So in the most general term, you're not going to have either of the situations you described, right? So it's not that the past is totally uniform and unrelated to what you're going to do. And it's also not that it reflects precisely your past experience. In the real situation, the agent, you are going to influence what you're going to be exposed to. And this will get to a very interesting question of how people develop their interests.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So, right, you shape your own environment. I wonder if you can incorporate that.
Yeah. So one key assumption in our model is that, yeah, so we're sort of saying you're going to have the opportunity to make this choice, and we're sort of analyzing that choice, but we're not assuming that you have made those choices in the past, right? So we're assuming that you're sort of getting IID samples from the world of the stimuli, and now you have a moment where you say, okay, now you can study one of those in more detail. Which one do you want to choose? Whereas, yeah, I think a realistic sort of more autonomous agent would be going and choosing what to explore in a way where they have control over their environment. And so I think in that context, you get back into things that are much more like sort of like multi-arm bandit sorts of settings, right? Where at every choice that you're making, you run into this explore exploit trade-off. And we've cut that loop by making the assumption that you're getting the samples generated by the environment. And so analyzing that situation is much more complicated.
Okay. Okay. And my second question was related to your task of the analysis of the Rangel task. And I didn't quite, okay, so I wonder if you can comment to the this tension that I mentioned about exploring the most valuable option versus exploring the option that you know least about. So at least in principle, you could explore an option that you don't prefer, that you may not prefer, just in order to reject it more confidently.
Yeah.
Right. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So that's not how it works out in our model. So when we look at what the optimal strategy looks like, just in that sampling model, as I showed you, you're going to focus more on sampling the things that are preferred outcomes. And it's kind of, I agree with you with that intuition, but the reason why you see that behavior is that you're basically like, the potential decision relevance is higher for drawing samples from things that have higher values, right?
Yeah.
So if you, so like if you can kind of think about like what direction your errors could go, and I think finding out that something is really bad is useful, but finding out that it's sort of in the middle isn't that helpful. Whereas finding out that something is intermediately good is sort of slightly better than that, in the sense of giving you some information about something that's likely to be a good outcome at the end.
Yeah, but it would be really interesting. You could set up the task in a way that you highlight this conflict. Like, for example, there might be different costs on items, and people might fixate to find out the cost.
Yeah,
and
the other important thing I didn't talk about here is what your priors are for what those values are. So you can actually show that this model produces behavior that's extremely similar to a drift diffusion model, in the circumstance where you start out with a very low prior value for items, because in that case, every sample you're drawing is driving up your estimate of value in a way that looks like an accumulator model.
Great, thank you. Maybe I see, Mark, I see your hand, but I'm just wondering if we could do one audience question first, because they only have like 10 minutes left of time. Okay, wonderful. So Joseph asks, could the inverse U-shape be an outcome of a combination between a familiarity and a novelty preference?
Yeah, I think that's, so remember, I said at the start, I'm going to give you a computational level story, right? So I'm not saying anything about the mechanisms that instantiate those kinds of things. Now, if you know that there are these different modes that you might want to be in, depending on the nature of the environment that you're in, you could think about building algorithms that are going to have those properties in terms of maybe you have, a novelty preference and a familiarity preference, and the way that you combine those together, right? So like the kind of prediction is that you're driven to you're driven to familiarity more in an environment that's stable, and then when you get into an unstable environment, then you don't have that drive. And you could imagine constructing a kind of algorithmic level explanation that incorporates those kinds of principles. And in fact, that's the kind of thing that people have suggested in the past.
Yeah, great. And one just a little side note, one of the audience members asked if you wouldn't mind going back to just your conclusion slide while we chat about them, if that's okay. Thank you so much. And then Mark, the floor is yours, please.
Sure. I was wondering, Tom, I didn't see this go by, so it's possible you mentioned it, but during the spider experiment, was there a maximum time for each decision?
So there, the penalties that people had were based on clicks rather than time. So there is a maximum in terms of there's only, so many objects that you can click on.
So the reason I'm asking this is I wonder if you considered whether the results would change as a function of having a maximum time for decisions, ranging from 100 milliseconds, for example, to 5 seconds. Would people act differently in that context? Yeah,
so we've done those kinds of manipulations where, so it's complicated. This gets into meta level, right? so I think one of the things that's interesting about this is that we can distinguish the kind of execution of the strategy from the learning of that strategy. And these are things that operate on different timescales, right? But if you think about this in the context of our problem, people are perhaps having to adapt the strategies that they're using at the same time as their exit strategies. And so if you put a time limit on, you don't know, you're basically time limiting both of those processes. And so that's the reason why we focused on an action limit rather than a time limit, is because we want people to have the opportunity to develop an adaptive strategy and then see what those adaptive strategies look like.
I see. Thanks.
Okay, I think we are running over of time, running a little bit out of time. Let's thank Tom again. And before we conclude the session, maybe Tom, you can stop sharing your screen.
Yep.
Still there? Okay. Because I like to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Could you see my screen?
Yes, we can. It's not projected in presenter mode, though.
Yeah.
There you go.
Okay. So we are arriving at the end of the symposium, at least for the general audience. And I'd like to thank all the speakers for their wonderful contributions, which were very stimulating, for the interesting discussion. I'd like to thank the audience, the many people out there who contributed with their question and joined us for these 2 days. Then, in addition, I'd like to thank Wolfram and Ali Reza, who were the masterminds, the conceptual minds behind all these things. They basically came up with a program and so on and so forth. They thought about where to publish the recordings and things like this. Then I'd like to thank Mackenzie, who basically was a very great co-moderator, and she really ran the chat in a wonderful fashion. Johanni, who was a great co-moderator. And there was one person in the back, that was Alexander, who basically just cared about all the questions in the Q&A session. And most importantly, usually a little bit the unfair thing, that those who have done most of the work are the most invisible ones. So I like to render them visible now. This is actually Etchi, who did all the organizational work behind this. She cared about all the web stuff. She cared about all the organizational things, kept the contact with the speakers, and so on and so forth. And there's Aurélien Toc, who basically was the mastermind behind all the Zoom. And without him, I think we wouldn't have had a very nice workshop. I think the meeting was very nice. I think it worked quite fine with Zoom. The only sad thing is that we cannot give them real flowers. So here are some flowers, some virtual flowers, and we need to see what we can do in the future with some real stuff. Okay, I'd like to thank all of the audience once more, all the speakers, all the organizers, and I think that's now the end of the meeting, at least for those who are not taking part of the deliberations we have right now. Thank you very much. Goodbye.